They call it America's Forgotten War, a war that lasted more than 3 years, a war that claimed the lives of over 200,000 Filipinos, most of them civilians. And yet, in American classrooms and textbooks, it is barely mentioned. This is the story of the U.S.-Philippine War, a conflict born out of broken promises, imperial ambition, and unimaginable cruelty. To understand how it began, we must look back to 1898. That year, the United States fought Spain in what became known as the Spanish-American War. The spark came when the battleship USS Maine exploded in Havana Harbor, Cuba. American newspapers blamed Spain, fueling public outrage and calls for war. But beyond the explosion, there were larger motives. Many Americans sympathized with Cuban rebels fighting for independence, and U.S. leaders also saw opportunity. By defeating Spain, America could expand overseas and take its place as a global power. The war lasted only a few months. In battles from Cuba to the Pacific, the U.S. Navy and Army crushed Spain's forces. One of those battles took place in Manila Bay, where Admiral George Dewey destroyed the Spanish fleet, instantly securing American control of the Philippines. For Filipinos, this moment was supposed to mark freedom. For more than 300 years, they had lived under Spanish colonial rule. And under the leadership of Emilio Aguinaldo, Filipino revolutionaries had already been fighting for independence. Aguinaldo even declared a Philippine Republic in June 1898, believing the United States was their ally. But behind closed doors, Washington had other plans. President William McKinley and U.S. policymakers saw the Philippines not as a free nation, but as a strategic prize, a gateway to Asia, and especially to China's lucrative markets. At the Treaty of Paris, signed in December 1898, Spain ceded the Philippines to the United States for $20 million. The voices of Filipinos were not invited and not considered. Aguinaldo and his followers, who thought they were on the road to independence, suddenly realized they were being handed from one colonial master to another. The stage was set for conflict. On February 4, 1899, the first shots were fired outside Manila. An American sentry shot a Filipino soldier, sparking a clash that quickly spread into open war. At first, Aguinaldo's forces attempted conventional battles. They lined up their troops, attacked fortified positions, and fought as regular armies. But the United States had overwhelming advantages: modern rifles, heavy artillery, and tens of thousands of soldiers arriving by ship. By late 1899, the Filipinos were forced to change strategy. Aguinaldo abandoned conventional warfare and ordered a shift to guerrilla tactics. Small bands of fighters, armed with rifles or even bolos, long machetes, ambushed U.S. patrols, melted into jungles, and struck supply lines. What could have been a short conflict turned into a grinding war of attrition. The American military was unprepared for guerrilla warfare. Frustration soon turned into brutality. General Arthur MacArthur, father of the famous World War II General Douglas MacArthur, took command in 1900. His philosophy was harsh: crush resistance by destroying its base of support, the people themselves. Entire villages suspected of aiding guerrillas were burned to the ground. Crops were destroyed. Livestock was slaughtered. Filipino civilians were herded into reconcentration zones, similar to camps that Spain had once used in Cuba. Inside these camps, disease and starvation spread rapidly. One American general, J.F. Franklin Bell, openly admitted his strategy. He declared the entire population must be placed under the strictest surveillance. We will confine them in camps until they learn submission. For civilians, daily life became a nightmare. Villages were torched, family members disappeared, hunger stalked the countryside. Beyond the official campaigns, there was also the cruelty of individual soldiers, acts that today would be prosecuted as war crimes. Perhaps the most infamous was the water cure. Prisoners, whether suspect fighters or innocent civilians, were pinned down. Soldiers forced gallons of water into their mouths until they could no longer breathe. Then, sometimes, the soldier would stomp on the prisoner's stomach, forcing the water out in a torrent of pain. Survivors often described it as a form of drowning on land. American soldiers also carried out summary executions. Villagers accused, sometimes with little evidence, of helping guerrillas were shot on sight. Reports surfaced of entire groups of men lined up and executed in retaliation for guerrilla attacks. The cruelty reached a horrifying peak in Samar in 1901. After Filipino guerrillas killed 48 American soldiers in the town of Balangiga, U.S. General Jacob H. Smith gave a chilling order to his troops. "I want no prisoners. I want you to kill and burn. The more you kill and burn, the more it will please me." The interior of Samar must be made a howling wilderness. When asked the age limit for those to be spared, Smith infamously replied, 10 years and up. Anyone capable of bearing arms must be killed. The campaign that followed became known as the Balangiga Massacre, not only for the American dead, but for the brutal retaliation that left countless Filipino civilians slaughtered and villages erased. Even American newspapers at the time reported on the atrocities, shocking the public. Soldiers wrote home with disturbing confessions. One private admitted, "We burned every town and everything in them. The inhabitants are suffering immensely." The result of this war was catastrophic for the Filipino population. Historians estimate that 200,000 to 300,000 civilians died, not only from bullets and blades, but from starvation, disease, and displacement caused by the war. Cholera and smallpox spread through reconcentration camps. Families who had tilled the same land for generations suddenly found their homes reduced to ashes. And yet, the U.S. government insisted it was bringing benevolent assimilation, the idea that America was uplifting, educating, and civilizing its new subjects. In reality, the people of the Philippines were enduring one of the most devastating chapters of their history. But even in the face of overwhelming violence, the Filipinos did not surrender easily. Guerrilla bands continued to fight in the mountains and jungles. Emilio Aguinaldo, though captured in 1901, remained a symbol of resistance. And back in the United States, a new debate was stirring. Writers, politicians, and activists began to ask, was this America's destiny or its betrayal? While the war raged across the Philippines, an equally fierce debate was unfolding back in the United States. Many Americans celebrated victory over Spain in 1898. Newspapers hailed the dawn of a new empire. Politicians spoke of America's civilizing mission. President William McKinley even claimed that he prayed to God and concluded it was America's duty to uplift and Christianize the Filipinos, a statement that ignored the fact that the Filipinos was already a deeply Catholic nation. But not everyone accepted this narrative. Writers, intellectuals, and political leaders began to question whether the United States, born in revolution against empire, now risked betraying its own ideals. The Anti-Imperialist League, founded in 1898, became the loudest voice of protest. Its members included businessmen, politicians, labor leaders, and cultural figures. Among them was Mark Twain, one of America's greatest authors. Twain was unsparing in his criticism. He declared, "I am opposed to having the eagle put its talons on any other land." After reading reports of atrocities, Twain's outrage deepened. He described the U.S. mission in the Philippines not as liberation, but as conquest, and he called it a betrayal of America's founding principles. Other critics argued that empire abroad would corrupt democracy at home. If America justified ruling other nations without consent, what would stop it from eroding freedoms within its own borders? But their voices were often drowned out. Pro-war politicians insisted the Philippines was necessary for America's global rise, for military bases, and for trade with Asia. The cost in lives, they argued, was the price of progress. Meanwhile, in the Philippines, resistance continued despite crushing odds. In 1901, American forces finally captured Emilio Aguinaldo. After months of pursuit, they tricked their way into his camp in the northern mountains. Taken prisoner, Aguinaldo eventually swore allegiance to the United States. For Washington, his capture was a symbolic victory. Newspapers declared the war nearly over. But on the ground, fighting still raged. Local commanders and guerrilla leaders refused to lay down arms. The struggle continued in remote provinces for years. Even without Aguinaldo, the dream of independence lived on. With resistance persisting, the U.S. military escalated its campaigns. The cruelty of earlier years did not fade. In many ways, it intensified. Villages suspected of harboring guerrillas were razed. Entire communities were relocated. Prisoners were tortured. One U.S. officer described orders he had received. Quote, "Kill and burn. This is no time to take prisoners. The more you kill and burn, the more it will please General Smith." End quote. Journalists who visited the islands reported scenes of devastation, smoking ruins of villages, starving families in camps, children orphaned by the conflict. Despite censorship, enough testimony leaked out that congressional hearings were held in Washington. Soldiers, officers, and missionaries testified about what they had seen. While some downplayed the atrocities, others confirmed them in detail. Yet the war went on. In July 1902, President Theodore Roosevelt, who had succeeded McKinley after his assassination, declared the war officially over. By then, major organized resistance had been broken. American forces controlled most towns and roads. A civil government was established, with William Howard Taft as the first civilian governor of the Philippines. But the reality was more complex. Fighting continued in the southern islands, especially in Mindanao and among the Muslim Moro population, well into the 1910s. To many Filipinos, the war did not truly end in 1902. It simply shifted into new forms of resistance. Still, Roosevelt's declaration allowed the United States to move forward as if the conflict was behind them. For the Filipino people, however, the scars were only beginning to show. The numbers remain staggering. Historians estimate 200,000 to 300,000 Filipino civilians perished during the war. Some argue the toll was even higher. Most died not in combat, but from disease, famine, and displacement caused by U.S. military policies. On the American side, about 4,200 soldiers were killed, with thousands more wounded. For every U.S. soldier who died, dozens of Filipinos, fighters and civilians alike, lost their lives. The brutality of the war shocked even seasoned observers. Senator George Frisbee Hoar of Massachusetts, an anti-imperialist, lamented, quote, "You have transformed a people who were ready to kiss the hem of the garment of the American Republic into sullen and irreconcilable enemies, possessed of a hatred which centuries cannot eradicate." End quote. Despite the bloodshed, the Philippines did not gain independence. Instead, they became an American colony. The United States poured resources into building schools, roads, and public health programs. English was introduced as a language of instruction. Supporters of American rule pointed to these as signs of progress. But the deeper truth was undeniable. Filipinos had been denied the very independence they had fought for. Their first republic had been crushed, their revolution smothered. For decades, the Philippines remained under American control. Only after World War II, in 1946, did they finally achieve independence. Even then, the legacy of the war, political, cultural, and emotional, continued to shape relations between the two nations. Why then has this war faded into obscurity, especially in the United States? One reason is timing. The war occurred between two larger and more famous events, the Spanish-American War of 1898 and World War I in 1914. In American memory, it was overshadowed. Another reason is discomfort. The USP-Philippines War contradicted the national story Americans like to tell about themselves, a story of freedom, democracy, and liberation. To remember the Philippines meant to confront torture, massacres, and empire. And so for generations, it was largely left out of textbooks. For the Philippines, the war was a crucible of nationalism. The sacrifices of Aguinaldo's fighters and of countless unnamed civilians became part of the foundation of a modern Filipino identity. Independence would be delayed, but it would not be denied. For the United States, the war marked its first step as a global imperial power. It set precedents for future conflicts, counterinsurgency, occupation, debates over torture, and the question of how far America would go to expand its influence. Mark Twain's warning still echoes that by conquering others, America risked losing itself. The USP-Philippines War is more than a forgotten chapter of history. It is a mirror. It shows us the costs of empire, the promises broken, the lives destroyed, the ideals compromised. It reminds us that freedom is not something given by an empire, but something fought for by the people themselves. And it challenges us, even today, to ask difficult questions. Whose voices are silenced in the telling of history? Whose suffering is erased? And what does it mean, truly, to be free?